Red Bull hoped its season would be revitalised by the first crisis remedy for its troubled 2024 Formula 1 car. But not only did it lose the lead in the Constructors' Championship to McLaren in Azerbaijan, but Max Verstappen also had his worst weekend of the year despite the introduction of an upgrade. Verstappen finished 5th, one place behind title rival Lando Norris. While he's finished lower than that this season, taking 6th at Monaco and Monza, he was going to be 7th on merit before a late crash wiped out Sergio Perez and Carlos Sainz. And although that crash promoted Verstappen 2 places, it actually hurt his championship bid, given he just made a late pit stop to bolt on softs and take fastest lap, only for the resulting virtual safety car to make that impossible. That meant a 3-point gain for Norris, who also claimed fastest lap. But still, Verstappen has a healthy lead of 59 points with 7 races and 3 sprints remaining. More damaging was the Constructors' Championship swing, with McLaren taking a 20-point lead thanks to Perez's late elimination and Oscar Piastri's brilliant victory after passing Charles Leclerc in the second stint and holding him off to the checkered flag. As Red Bull team principal Christian Horner put it, "We're now not defending, we're chasing." But worst of all was the fact that Verstappen struggled and was behind his teammate both in qualifying, for the first time since Miami last year, and the race. And that's a concern, given even when he struggled with the car this season, it's never been quite that bad. Overall, his performance was not so different to Monza, but it's a disappointment for Red Bull given there were encouraging signs in Azerbaijan that Red Bull has understood its recent F1 troubles and started to fix them. But that was ultimately overshadowed by another winless weekend, and even if Perez hadn't clashed with Sainz, he'd likely have finished 3rd or 4th. The wait for a Red Bull victory goes on, and it's now in the midst of a 7-race drought. With Singapore coming up next, the scene of its one defeat last year, hopes aren't high that will change soon. Despite Verstappen enduring a nightmare weekend, there were still some reasons for optimism at Red Bull. At Monza, the Red Bull was the clear 4th fastest car, and both drivers filled the 4th row of the grid, while in Azerbaijan, the Red Bulls qualified 4th and 6th as the top 4 teams were closely matched, although some classic Baku brilliance from poleman Charles Leclerc flattered Ferrari and made it look like it had a particularly big advantage. And despite being outperformed by Perez, Verstappen didn't cut as frustrated a figure as you might imagine in Baku. After qualifying, he was actually confident that the RB20 was no longer a monster, and that a setup change that tipped the car's balance back over the limits had done the most damage ahead of a difficult session. But Red Bull was at least back in play from the start of practice. The RB20 was more competitive, and a big part of that is its aptitude in short corners. The relatively small spread of corner speeds in Baku meant the car's inherent difficulty in getting a workable balance window between low and high speed doesn't punish it so harshly. The challenge is in setting up the car so the drivers can attack the tight 90-degree corners without sacrificing too much speed on the 2.2km start-finish straight. Red Bull chose the relatively big rear wing it raced at Spa with a substantially cut back beam wing. It meant higher grip levels, especially compared to low downforce Monza, and both drivers were happier. Verstappen was confident Red Bull had improved the car, specifically the disconnect between the front and rear, and that it had a more stable and predictable platform. Verstappen reckoned even 2nd or 3rd on the grid might have been possible for him with a cleaner run in Q3. Verstappen had a difficult time in the race. He ran 5th early on after overtaking George Russell, but inevitably slipped back behind him in the second stint. He then fell behind Norris, who was recovering from 15th on the grid after an unfortunately timed yellow flag led to his elimination in Q1 to run 7th, and he was still there when the late crash bumped him back up to 5th. It wasn't an easy race for Verstappen. He complained about a lack of bite in the first part of the race and had braking troubles in the second stint. But despite what was Verstappen's weakest performance personally this season, there is at least an air of confidence that Red Bull has started to put itself together. As Verstappen said, even on a bad weekend for him, Red Bull didn't lose too many points and things can improve. That's partly because the floor upgrade was more positive than the results suggest. But it's going to take more than that to get Red Bull completely back on track. Perez performing more strongly than Verstappen was a timely boost for him, given the pressure he's been under recently. Perez has bemoaned balance problems with the RB20 for months. He feels it's got so bad that even Verstappen's finally struggling, and now people are paying attention. But it's also true that Perez is simply doing a better job than he was before the summer break, when speculation about his future was peaking and there was a genuine risk of him being dropped mid-season. So with his confidence restored after that summer reset, and some progress being made on the car side too, Perez has picked himself up admirably. Perfect timing to go to Azerbaijan then. Perez loves this track and had the edge on Verstappen there last year as well. Verstappen has historically used braking deep into the corner and releasing the brakes late to help achieve his rotation, but the Red Bull didn't really allow him to do that in Baku, just as it hasn't for the last few races. Basically, it's pretty much fine when driven at race pace, although it wasn't for Max here, but as he goes for those last tenths, the understeer says no. Perez by comparison can deal with that understeer better with his natural style and still get the car rotated. He never overloads the front axle and it allows him to be hard and early on the throttle. It's repeatable and confidence-inspiring, which is valuable when there are walls to hit. It's a key reason why he's often excelled on street tracks. And so Perez felt and looked more confident than in a long time, with the car tweaks a key part of that. Perez called it the biggest upgrade we've done all year in terms of its effect on him, and claimed that if he had the feeling in the car in Baku that he'd had for much of the season while struggling, he would have had as disappointing a result to match. Horner even suggested Perez could have won the race, but for time lost at the start of the second stint, notably when Norris backed him up to allow Piastri to make his pit stop and stay ahead of the Red Bull. Of course, the collision with Sainz meant he didn't actually have a result to show for his efforts, but his performance is cause for optimism, especially given the upgrade that played a part in Red Bull's somewhat disguised progress in Baku. Red Bull revised the tunnel geometry on its RB20's latest floor with the aim of improving pressure gradients along the floor for better underbody aerodynamic performance. Chief Engineer Paul Monahan described it as a remarkably subtle change geometrically. This update is not Red Bull's definitive solution, and it was not expected to transform performance on a track like Baku, given the objective of the upgrade is creating a wider operating window that will make the car stronger on tracks with a broad range of corner speeds. That's why Red Bull's expecting its latest upgrade to have a bigger effect at some of the more flowing circuits that are still to come. Horner described it as teaching some valuable lessons and, with a helpful double negative, said that what Red Bull was doing would certainly not be unbeneficial for a race like this. Translation: the upgrade matters in some way or another. So let's explain why. The magnitude of the change was influenced by the short turnaround between the back-to-back races at Zandvoort and Monza and travelling to Baku. But Red Bull was determined to get something on the car here, and a further evolution might be ready in time for the next race in Singapore. The key thing is Red Bull reacted so quickly to its defeat to McLaren in the races in the Netherlands and Italy, and its particularly worrying form at the latter. Big upgrades require longer lead times, but getting something on the car so fast showed growing understanding of the problem, or at least that Red Bull had a good idea of what to target. Grander developments will have to wait until at least the United States Grand Prix in late October, which follows an unusually large gap in the schedule after Singapore. That could be an opportunity for Red Bull to introduce a bigger floor upgrade, but also complementary parts, and maybe even a new front wing that seeks to replicate the progress in aeroelasticity that McLaren and Mercedes have made this season. Red Bull's performance in Baku and how it fares in Singapore will set the final direction in terms of where it can allocate development and financial resources. It also has to consider whether it is willing to risk a major package for Austin, as that's a sprint weekend with only one practice session. If the car's already looking in better shape in the interim, maybe that won't be a gamble Red Bull needs to take. Verstappen and circumstances meant the damage was at least limited in Azerbaijan, but Red Bull still has some important work to do if it's to recapture race-winning form for the closing stages of the season. Despite a particularly poor weekend for its star driver, what it at least now has is evidence that it's finally going in the right direction.